Hola, I'm David Cott, host of New History of Spain, and this is episode 14, titled The Darkest Days of Visigothic Rule in Iberia. In this episode, you will learn about the political history of the Iberian Peninsula during the first half of the 6th century, how the Goths settled in Hispania, how many arrived, and how cities and the countryside changed during the Visigothic period. The post-Roman wall after the Battle of Vouillé. Let's start by stepping away from Hispania and the Visigoths for a moment to look at the political situation in the Mediterranean after the dramatic Battle of Vouillé, which we covered at the end of episode 13, how Majorian almost saved the Roman Empire. The Kingdom of the Franks was a rising power that controlled most of present-day France. Clovis I ruled a territory stretching from Toulouse in the southern Gaul to the Rhine River in western Germany. The Burgundians were in a tough spot because their kingdom, which included Lyon and western Switzerland, made them an obvious target for the Franks. The Burgundians wanted to prevent the Franks from taking over southern Gaul at the Visigoths' expense, but since that had already happened, they tried to take advantage of the situation. However, that didn't go too well for them. The Roman Empire, which still existed in the east and is more commonly known as the Byzantine Empire, focused on reforming itself to avoid the fate of its western counterpart, which had been conquered. The Vandals remained powerful in North Africa and some Mediterranean islands, but they were no longer a major threat after losing battles against Berber tribes and the Ostrogoths. Meanwhile, Italy and parts of the Balkans were firmly under the control of the Ostrogoths, ruled by King Theudoric the Great. He proved to be a skilled administrator and a formidable rival to the Franks under Clovis. Theudoric soon came to rule over his Visigothic cousins to stop the expansion of the Franks. Meanwhile, Hispania was politically fragmented. In the northwest was the kingdom of the Suevi, and the Visigoths controlled most of the province of Tarraconensis and maybe had garrisons in other cities. But the rest of Hispania was under local rulers. This local fragmentation of political power is key to understanding how the Visigothic kingdom was established in Hispania and its limitations. Gesalec and the Ostrogothic intervention. I ended the last episode with the Battle of Vouillé, but we still need to cover what happened afterward because the war wasn't over yet. After the battle, the surviving Visigothic leaders chose Gesalec, the illegitimate son of Alaric II, as their king. They picked him because Alaric's legitimate son, Amalaric, was only 5 years old, and in such a time of adversity, they had to be pragmatic and chose someone from the Balti dynasty who could lead the army. Gesalec had a very important mission on his shoulders. He had to protect what was left of the Gothic army and their families to save the kingdom from complete destruction. To do this, Gesalec ordered his troops to retreat to the region of Septimania in southern France because the Franks had already captured Bordeaux and the former royal seat, Toulouse. Fortunately, most of the Visigothic royal treasure had been secured in Carcassonne. The royal treasure was crucial because it was a symbol of identity and prestige for any barbarian group, and was also needed to pay the troops and manage land and property records. Sensing an opportunity, the Burgundians acted like scavengers, launching a campaign that ended up defeating Gesalec and sacking Narbonne, the temporary Visigothic capital. This forced Gesalec to use Arles and Carcassonne as bastions for Visigothic resistance. The Franks and Burgundians gathered outside the walls of these cities, eager to seize Alaric's famous treasure and end the Visigoths as an independent barbarian people. But despite the repeated attacks, the city walls held. Finally, much-needed help arrived from the east. The Ostrogothic general Iba marched through Provence and Septimania, recapturing cities like Narbonne and forcing the Burgundians and Franks to leave their sieges of Arles and Carcassonne. Thus, the Second Franco-Gothic War ended in 509, leaving the Visigothic kingdom reduced to just Septimania and a few cities and garrisons in Hispania. You might think that with Theudoric the Great's help, Gesalec would be relieved, right? Well, not quite. Theodoric, acting as guardian for his grandson Amalaric, wanted to assert his grandson's dynastic rights. As a result, Gesalec and his followers went into exile in Barcelona, a situation much like Adolf's almost a century earlier, and his time in Hispania was equally disastrous. To resolve the situation, Theodoric sent his victorious general, Iba, to defeat Gesalec, and Iba succeeded. Gesalec sought refuge and support from the Vandals in North Africa, but their king only gave him financial aid because he wanted to avoid a military conflict with the powerful Ostrogoths. After that, Gesalec secretly returned to Gothic territory and tried to claim the throne with the support of the Franks. This attempt failed, and he was assassinated in 511. Chronicler Isidore of Seville remarked that Gesalec lost his honor first and then his life. Given the outcome of the war, most Visigoths realized that their best chance of surviving against the Franks was to join the Ostrogoths as junior partners, beginning the period known as the Ostrogothic Interlude. Ostrogothic Interlude and the Union of the Goths. Let me first explain what the Ostrogothic Interlude was. The Ostrogothic Interlude refers to the period of transition between the Visigothic Kingdom of Toulouse and the Visigothic Kingdom of Toledo. It lasted from the Battle of Vouillé in 507 until the death of King Theudigisel in 549. Many see this period as one where Theodoric the Great's rule heavily influenced the course of events. Theodoric ruled both the Visigoths and the Ostrogoths, and in the Visigothic kingdom he was succeeded by King Amalaric, the last of the Balti dynasty, and then by two Ostrogothic generals, Theudis and Theudigisel. Some historians describe this time as one when an Ostrogothic ruling faction governed over the Visigoths, but this is not entirely accurate, as there was plenty of cooperation between Visigoths and Ostrogoths as well as marriages. After Clovis died in 511, his Frankish kingdom was divided among his sons of the Merovingian dynasty, giving the Goths some breathing room. Theodoric the Great now ruled over all of the Goths in Western Europe, with his territory stretching from Italy and Pannonia to Tarraconensis and other parts of Hispania. There is some debate about whether Theodoric should be seen as the regent of the Visigothic kingdom on behalf of his grandson Amalaric, or as its king in his own right. But given his actions, I think it's more accurate to call him the king of the Visigoths. He appointed and removed officials, controlled tax collection, and placed Ostrogothic troops in Hispania and Septimania. Theodoric the Great ruled both Italy and Hispania by respecting the old Roman administration. In a way, he acted both as a king for the Goths and a high-ranking official for the Romans. He even sought legitimacy from the Eastern Roman Empire and restored some Roman institutions in his territories, like the prefectures and a senate with renewed power. Theodoric is a good example of a ruler who strengthened his power by presenting himself as the Roman emperor, not as a barbarian king. He aimed to keep the Goths united to counter the growing power of the Franks and the Eastern Romans in Constantinople. During his rule, marriages between Ostrogothic and Visigothic magnates were common, and people moved freely between their territories. However, his dream of a unified Gothic kingdom fell apart after his son-in-law and heir died, and after Theudis' power grew in Hispania. Theodoric had appointed Theudis as the commander of the Visigothic army and the guardian of his grandson, Amalaric. But Theudis used this position to build his own network of clients, gaining almost complete independence from Theodoric. He even managed to marry a very wealthy Hispano-Roman woman, showing that marriages between Goths and Hispano-Romans were already happening, even though they were not allowed under Roman law due to fiscal reasons, not racial ones, as Goths had arrived as soldiers and that had some tax benefits. The last years of Theodoric's rule were marked by internal struggles over succession and growing tensions with the Roman Empire and neighboring kingdoms. Thus, the last thing the Ostrogothic king needed was to start a war against Theudis and his followers, and Theudis was clever enough to stay loyal to him and Amalaric in name only, and keep sending tribute. When Theodoric died in 526, the union of the Visigoths and Ostrogoths and the dream of a single Gothic kingdom ended. The Reign of Amalaric. After the Goths split up, one of Theodoric's grandsons became king of the Ostrogoths in Italy, while Amalaric, now an adult, finally ruled the Visigoths on his own. The Visigoths stopped paying the annual tribute to the Ostrogoths, and the Ostrogoths gave back the Visigothic royal treasure. This agreed separation also led to territorial changes. Amalaric had to give Provence to his cousin, and Visigoths and Ostrogoths were free to choose which king to follow. Amalaric set up his royal seat in Narbonne, and this is an important detail because the center of Visigothic power was still in Gaul, though reduced to the province of Septimania. Amalaric tried to reduce Theudis' influence, but he had little success. Theudis had already built a strong network of supporters and had a large private guard, thanks to his wealthy Hispano-Roman wife. To counter this, Amalaric appointed a trusted man as prefect of Hispania, giving him both civil and military power. But these efforts were not enough to weaken Theudis' grip on power. Amalaric also used the Visigothic royal treasure to build his own support network, but it didn't significantly impact Theudis' influence. In the last year of Amalaric's reign, the Second Council of Toledo took place. The bishops asked the Visigothic king for permission to hold a new council, which shows two things. First, Visigothic rule was already recognized in central Iberia and much of Hispania. And second, it challenges the idea of Amalaric as an anti-Catholic Arian king, an image that still persists in some historical writings. Historian Pablo Poveda Arias pointed out that getting the support of Hispano-Roman bishops was a way for Amalaric to secure his political survival against the powerful Theudis. Bishop Montanus of Toledo also seemed to need Amalaric to remove his rivals, so it was a mutually beneficial relationship. We know more about Amalaric's foreign policy, as he aimed to restore the Visigoths' prestige and control over southern Gaul. He needed to defeat the Franks to silence his political rivals, so he led his troops himself, much like his father Alaric II had done. Unfortunately, Amalaric met the same fate as his father. The Frankish king of Paris and Orleans defeated the Visigothic army in Septimania in 531. Amalaric managed to flee to Barcelona, perhaps intending to sail to Italy to seek help from his Ostrogothic cousin. However, he was assassinated. Whether his own men under Theudis' orders or a Frank killed him remains unclear, but either way, Theudis was the main beneficiary of that assassination. He used his vast influence to be chosen as the new king of the Visigoths. This marked the extinction of the Balti dynasty, which had led the Visigoths since Alaric. The transfer of power and royal legitimacy weakened, as loyalty to the ruling family faded, and after this, father-to-son succession became very difficult in the Visigothic kingdom. So, the fall of the Balti dynasty was not good news for the kingdom's long-term stability. The settlement of the Goths in Hispania. In the last episode, I briefly mentioned the migration and settlement of the Visigoths in Hispania, but this topic is important enough to explore in more detail. Before the fall of the Visigothic kingdom of Toulouse, only a few Goths lived in Hispania. Most of them were soldiers, some with their families settled in cities and strategic locations like Barcelona, Zaragoza, and possibly Merida. Historians debate how large these migrations were. Some think there was already a steady flow of Visigoths moving to Hispania by the end of the 5th century. Others believe the Visigoths in Gaul migrated in large numbers only after the Battle of Vouillé. Historian Javier Arce argues that the Visigothic settlement in Hispania began in the late 5th century, but until 531, most Visigoths still lived in southern Gaul. He relies on a text by the Greek historian Procopius, who wrote that after Amalric's defeat by the Franks, quote, "The survivors of the vanquished emigrated from Gaul with their wives and children and went to Hispania, where Theudis ruled." End quote. José Soto Chica agrees with this view and suggests that there were three main waves of Gothic migration to Hispania. The first wave happened in the decade before the Battle of Vouillé, mainly involving soldiers sent to control the region of Tarraconensis, but it also included Goths fleeing from the growing pressure of the Franks. The second wave occurred after the defeats at Vouillé and Narbonne, and the largest wave came after Amalric's defeat and death. In Gaul, Roman authorities had organized the settlement of the Goths under the Hospitium system in 418. But in Hispania, the Goths didn't find any central authority to direct them. So, how were the lands divided? Did the Goths and the local Hispano-Romans negotiate land deals on their own in each area? We don't have clear answers, and we can only make educated guesses. In some cases, the Goths may have taken over empty or abandoned land, or former Roman state properties. In other cases, they might have made agreements or bought land from locals, whether in the cities or in the countryside. Archaeologists have also studied the settlement of the Goths in Hispania, but their findings led to different interpretations. What were once called Visigothic necropolises, mainly found in the northern Meseta in a Castilian-Leonese area known as Tierra de Campos, have been questioned. These burial sites contain objects linked to Visigothic styles, but since the 1990s, many archaeologists and historians have argued against directly associating objects with specific ethnic groups. One culture can adopt the styles of another. Imagine if a European was buried with a product manufactured in China, and future archaeologists assume he was Chinese because of that. That's the problem of this methodology. In fact, a source from that time, the anonymous Valesianus, said, quote, "The poor Roman imitates the Goth, while the wealthy Goth imitates the Roman." End quote. Another important question is how many Visigoths settled on the Iberian Peninsula. We know that not all Goths from Gaul moved. Some stayed but came under Frankish rule. We also need to consider the Ostrogoths who settled in the Visigothic kingdom during the reign of Theodoric the Great, especially in Septimania. Historian García Moreno believes the dynasty of Liuba and Leovigild likely had its roots in Septimania and was of Ostrogothic origin. It's important to remember that the Visigoths were a diverse group made up of different peoples who had joined them over time. From Alaric's era until their large-scale settlement in Hispania under Theudis, their population changed significantly, and they likely included people of various backgrounds. Considering these factors, as well as earlier estimates from the time of Vouillé, the number of Goths who moved to Hispania likely ranged between 70,000 and 100,000. If we consider that the population of Hispania at that time was between 4 and 6 million, the Goths made up less than 2% of the population they will come to rule. This is why their cultural and genetic impact was minimal. Their importance came from becoming the ruling elite. Theudis, Theudigisel, and the plague of Justinian. Returning to the political history of the Visigothic kingdom, the center of Visigothic power had shifted to Hispania, where Theudis had been elected king. Theudis aimed to strengthen the Visigothic kingdom and was the first Gothic king to establish his authority over much of Hispania, including the wealthy southern province of Baetica. On the international stage, the protagonist of this period was undoubtedly Emperor Justinian, who launched expensive military campaigns to restore Roman rule in the West. I will talk more about him and the Byzantine Empire in the next episode, so remember to follow New History of Spain on YouTube or podcast directories. In this context, Theudis' foreign policy can be described as cautious. He didn't try to reclaim lost Gothic territories in Gaul, nor get involved in the Gothic and Vandal wars that Justinian started to reconquer Italy and North Africa. In 534, the Greeks took the Vandal stronghold of Septem, modern-day Ceuta, and the Balearic Islands, And obviously, Theudis saw this as a direct threat to the Visigothic kingdom. During the start of the Gothic War, Theudis remained inactive until his nephew was chosen as king of the weakened Ostrogoths. Theudis likely promised to help his nephew, but he couldn't do so because the Merovingian Franks launched a campaign against the Visigoths in 541, possibly encouraged by Justinian. The Frankish army crossed the Pyrenees through Vasconia, sacked Tarraconensis, and even laid siege to Zaragoza. Theudis sent his general Theudigisel with an army to lift the siege, and the Franks were forced to end their campaign, with both sides claiming victory. However, there wasn't much to celebrate, because shortly afterward, the plague of Justinian hit Hispania. This was the first known outbreak of the bubonic plague, the same disease that resurfaced in the 14th century and still appears occasionally today. We don't know the full impact or duration of the plague in Hispania, but there is evidence from bacterial remains and church records from the Council of Valencia in 546. In writings from the 6th and 7th centuries, there are mentions of a repentinus orbitus, or sudden death, a death associated with the plague of Justinian. In the mass graves of Valencia, with up to 30 people in each, researchers have found biomolecules of the plague bacteria. In this context, the Council of Valencia stated that bishops should be buried in individual tombs. Yes, that's what they were worried about, not about preventing the spread of the disease. Therefore, their privileged social position was also reflected in their burial, even in a context of mass burials due to the high mortality caused by the bubonic plague pandemic. Shortly before his death, Theudis tried to conquer Byzantine Ceuta, seeing it as a constant threat to his kingdom, but his attempt failed miserably. Ceuta never came under direct Gothic control, even before the Muslim conquest with the whole story of Count Julian. The defeat at Ceuta may have led to Theudis' assassination in 548. After his death, his trusted general Theudigisel became king. However, his reign was very short, and we only know about his death in Seville. During a banquet, conspirators suddenly extinguished the candles and stabbed him to death, similar to the assassination of Julius Caesar. Allegedly, he was killed for having affairs with the wives of several Visigothic magnates and conspirators. This shows the risks of being too naughty, but he certainly had fun while it lasted. With Theudigisel's death, the Ostrogothic Interlude ended, and a new period of crisis and civil war began. Cities and the countryside in the Visigothic period. Ever since late antiquity started, and especially during and after the process of disintegration of the Western Roman Empire, the general trend in cities was contraction, neglect, and abandonment of spaces. Areas that were once full of life and inhabited turned into farmland, and people even buried their dead inside the city walls. Over old Roman theaters and amphitheaters, like those in Cartagena, Valencia, or Zaragoza, new houses and craft workshops were built. Public sewer systems were no longer maintained, and large Roman houses were divided into smaller homes. Public spaces that had been markets or government buildings were turned into churches and homes for bishops, thereby making the spiritual and political triumph of Christianity visible. The few monumental construction projects of the Visigothic period were Christian buildings, such as churches, shrines, and mausoleums for bishops. By the 6th century, these changes, which had already started as early as the 3rd century, had transformed ancient Roman cities into something closer to what we see in the medieval period. Despite the decline of cities and the economy, cities in Hispania remained the center of political life. This is different from other former Roman territories like Britannia or Gaul, where political power has shifted from cities to the countryside. In Hispania, this only happened later in the north with the rise of early Christian kingdoms, but not in Al-Andalus. However, in general, cities had weakened, and their influence over rural areas was not as strong as before. The countryside also changed. In elevated areas, small fortified villages called castella appeared. These villages were protected either by natural barriers or walls. It wasn't unusual for such fortifications to emerge in times of political instability. In fact, similar fortified sites, known as castros and oppida, existed in pre-Roman times. Monasteries also spread across rural areas, serving as self-sufficient communities. These monasteries, along with hermitages, played a key role in continuing to spread Christianity throughout the countryside of Hispania. In the early 6th century, many luxurious Roman villas or estates were abandoned, although a few remained and even grew. The general decline in wealth played a part in this, but there was also a growing concentration of wealth among fewer people. Many members of the Roman elite had taken on roles in the church and used their wealth to build churches and support charitable activities, so the ways of using wealth changed. Wealthy landowners often lived in major cities or in the fortified castella I have mentioned, and from there they delegated the management of their estates and lands to agents who represented them. Self-managed peasant communities emerged without a landlord. It seems that the villas that remained became the social and economic centers of small villages. This means that these villas changed from being private estates to more communal spaces. We see evidence of this in how many villas added small churches or chapels, how parts of all villas were repurposed for crafts and trades, and how nearby areas were used as cemeteries. So, in a way, the disappearance of Roman villas and the rise of medieval villages are two sides of the same coin.
The verdict!
In today's verdict, I want to talk about why having a strong system for choosing the next ruler is important. When the Balti dynasty ruled, the Visigoths had a system of succession for passing power within the family. But the dynasty's prestige collapsed after the Battle of Vouillé and was destroyed for good in 531 when Amalaric was defeated. After that, choosing a new ruler became a constant problem for the Visigoths, leading to many revolts, palace conspiracies, and civil wars. After the end of the Balti dynasty, the Visigothic kingdom had an elective succession system, though those who took power often tried to establish hereditary dynasties. The Roman Empire faced a similar issue, as its institutions were not strong enough to stop frequent usurpations and coups. The best way to choose a monarch would probably be an elective system within the royal family, with some kind of test to find the best possible successor, whether male or female. But better if you don't have a monarchy in the first place. In any case, the best way to ensure a dynasty's survival is for the ruler to prove their effectiveness. If they fail, the dynasty may fall. And with that, the verdict ends. Many thanks to the patrons of the show like Xavier, Robbie, Richard, GP, Puts, or CLO. You can also support my work and get early access, exclusive merchandise, or be mentioned in an episode by joining at patreon.com/newhistoryspain. Thanks to everyone who has purchased paid subscriptions on Apple Podcasts, and you can find links to the Discord server or ways for one-time donations in the description. In the next episode, I will talk about the Byzantine province of Hispania, the society of the Visigothic kingdom, and the Visigothic civil war between Achilla and Athanagild. Subscribe so you don't miss it, and thank you for listening!